You don't belong in that world, Elias. You're too ordinary. You never did. 2 years of marriage. That was all it was worth. Camille stood at the mirror, adjusting her necklace. Already dressed for the Delacroix Gala. Already decided before she ever opened her mouth. Elias stood in the bedroom doorway and let the words land the way they were meant to, like a door being locked from the outside. "So who are you going with?" he asked. She reached for her gloves. "Weston Ashby." Just like that. No explanation. No hesitation. The woman he had put away his own name for was choosing another man right in front of him, and she did not even turn around to do it. He stepped back from the doorway. "Go, then." She walked out, her heels steady on the hardwood, never once slowing. The door clicked shut, and for the first time in 2 years, Elias Rourke stopped making himself smaller. He stood still for exactly 5 seconds in the silence of that house, then took out his phone and dialed a number he had not called since his wedding day. It rang once. "Gus," he said, "tell Mr. Warren I'm coming tonight." There was a long pause on the other end, then the voice of an older man, slow and careful, the voice of someone who had been waiting 2 years and had known how to wait without losing himself in it. "You sure? Once you step out, there's no stepping back." Elias looked out the window, where the lights of the New Orleans port stretched across the black water. "I've been stepping back for 2 years, Gus. And while I have you the renewal period for the permit to operate Pier 9. When is it due?" In all that time, his wife had never once asked him what his father did for a living. Not once. Because people only look into the things they believe are worth something. There was the sound of papers being turned on the other end, slowly and carefully, the way a 58-year-old man did everything when he didn't want to get a single word wrong. 9 weeks, Gus replied. "The Port Authority Board is holding the vote in the 10th week." Elias said nothing. He waited, because after 34 years he had learned that the most important part of a conversation was often the part people hadn't said yet. "Someone has filed a competing application," Gus said. "Last month." "Who?" There was a silence longer than it needed to be. "Royce Kettering." The name fell into the room and stayed there. Elias hadn't heard that name in 2 years. And in those 2 years he hadn't needed to, because Royce Kettering was the kind of man who only moved when there was an opening to move into. That meant that somewhere, during the time Elias had been learning to eat dinner at 7 and stop answering calls after 9, an opening had formed, and Royce had seen it before he had. "What do you want me to do?" Gus asked. "Nothing yet." Elias looked outside, where the harbor lights still stretched across the water as they did every other night, utterly unaware that something had just changed. "Tonight I need to know who stands up and who doesn't." "You're really going to do this tonight?" "I've been doing it for 2 years, Elias said. "I just haven't had a reason." He ended the call and stood there a little longer with the phone still in his hand. He thought he'd just asked a question about paperwork. He thought he'd just confirmed a name. It would take him another 3 weeks to understand that the call he'd just made wasn't him reaching for a file, but him placing his hand on the end of a cord that had already been pulled tight 6 months earlier, and at the other end of that cord was the woman who had just walked out of his house with her gloves in her hands and hadn't slowed down even once. At 9 o'clock that evening, the 3rd floor of the old building on Chartres Street had only one window still lit, and Sadie Merrick was still sitting there with the ledgers open in front of her. She'd stayed later than this many times over the past 5 years, often enough that the security guard in the lobby no longer asked her when she planned to leave. Her phone vibrated on the desk. She looked at the name on the screen, and in the brief moment before she touched it, something passed across her face and disappeared, because this wasn't the hour he called, and in the 2 years since, he'd almost never called in the evening. "I'm going to the Delacroix Gala tonight," Elias said. She didn't ask why. She didn't ask what had happened. Didn't ask whether he was sure. Didn't ask where his wife was. And most of all, she didn't ask the question anyone else in this city would have asked, what had happened after 2 years of silence. She simply reached for her pen. What time? That was why he called her instead of anyone else. Some people reacted to news by asking questions. Sadie Merrick reacted by going to work. "I'll be there at 10, he said. "I need to know who's in the room. I'll have the list before you arrive." She ended the call and sat perfectly still for exactly 3 seconds. 3 seconds was all she allowed herself, and she'd trained herself in that discipline so long that it no longer hurt her. Or at least she'd stopped calling the feeling by its name. Then she opened her computer. The guest list for the Delacroix Gala wasn't public, but the list of sponsors was, And for someone who'd spent 5 years reading Port Authority records, the two told the same story if you knew how to place them beside each other. She printed it and spread the pages across the desk. She read with the tip of her pen, slowly, one line at a time, the way an accountant read rather than the way a curious person did. Familiar names passed before her one after another. Old families from the Garden District, 2 retired federal judges, the chairman of the Port Authority, and all 3 commissioners with voting power. She made notes in the margins, brief and emotionless. Then her pen stopped. Royce Kettering. She stared at the name much longer than she had the others, then drew one firm circle around it, and she didn't need anyone to explain why. That man had filed a competing application for Pier 9 the month before. That man would be in the same room as Elias Rourke less than an hour from now, on the very night Elias had decided to step into the light for the first time in 2 years. And in all her life, Sadie had never known a coincidence at the Port of New Orleans to truly be a coincidence. She wrote 3 words beside the circle and continued reading down. The sponsor list was on the final page, printed in smaller type, the part no one read because no one thought it said anything. She read it because she always read it. And on the 4th line from the bottom, her pen stopped for the 2nd time. An investment entity registered in Baton Rouge, with a name that sounded like 100 others. The kind of name designed precisely so no one would remember it. But Sadie had seen it somewhere. She sat very still and tried to trace it back. Not in a client file. Not in a company ledger. Somewhere else, farther away, older, in a thick file she'd once read from beginning to end on some night long ago. For no particular reason, she should have remembered such a detail. She closed her eyes for a moment. It wouldn't come. That was the most frustrating feeling in the world for a person who lived by her memory of numbers, the feeling of knowing with absolute certainty that she'd once held this exact thing in her hands, but couldn't find the road back to where she'd set it down. She uncapped her pen and circled the name, a 2nd circle on the page, lighter than the first because her hand hesitated. Then she wrote a question mark beside it. That was all. She folded the list, placed it in her briefcase, switched off the desk lamp, and stood up. And as she walked down the dark staircase, she decided that tomorrow morning she would search until she found where she'd seen it. It would take her several more days to remember, and when she did, it would be 2 a.m, and there would be no way left to keep from understanding. Before leaving the building, Sadie turned into the small room behind the reception desk, where the safe was kept, the one only 2 people in the company had the code to. She opened it, took out a flat wooden box from the bottom compartment, behind folders containing old tax records, and held it in her hand for a moment before placing it in her briefcase. It was much lighter than the weight it had carried inside that safe for 2 years. Her car arrived in front of his house at 9:40. Elias stepped outside, already dressed, and stopped when he saw her standing beside the car with the box in her hand. "I thought you'd need this," she said. He looked down. On their wedding day, after everyone had gone, he had handed that box to her in the hotel hallway and said exactly one thing: "Put it away, or throw it away. It's up to you." Then turned and walked back inside, and never mentioned it again. He opened the lid. The Rourke family signet ring lay exactly where she had kept it, clean, without a single tarnished spot. Something that could only happen if someone occasionally took it out and polished it. "Did you know this day would come?" he asked. "No." Sadie looked straight at him, her voice as calm as though she were reporting an expense. "I just didn't believe it should be thrown away." He picked up the ring and slipped it onto his finger. It fit perfectly, because in 2 years he hadn't gained weight or lost any. He had simply lived a life that demanded nothing from him. He turned it once with his thumb, an old movement his hand remembered before his mind did, and Sadie turned away to open the car door before he could look up. On the way to the hotel, she sat in the front seat, her briefcase open across her lap, the guest list resting on the writing board. Her phone vibrated. She looked at the name and answered, and her voice changed completely, softening in a way only one person in the world could make it soften. "I'm working," she said. "Did you just finish your treatment?" Colin's voice on the other end was clearly trying to sound stronger than he really was. The voice of a 21-year-old who had spent 3 sessions a week at the dialysis center for 2 years and still insisted on turning everything into a joke. He told her about the new nurse who couldn't tell which arm had the fistula, told her he'd won 3 straight games of chess against the old man in the next bed, then asked whether she'd eaten dinner, and Sadie lied and said she had. "You stayed late again," Colin said. "You always stay late." "I've been working for someone who pays on time for 5 years," she replied. I'm allowed to stay late, he laughed. And in that laugh she heard what both siblings knew and never said aloud, that the money wasn't only paying for the apartment. Their father had gone to work the morning shift at warehouse number 7 on a Tuesday in June and never come home. Sadie had been 12 then. Their mother held on for another 3 years and then she was gone too. And from that point on, Sadie grew up faster than she should have. That was the whole story, and she had told it to exactly 2 people in her life, and she wasn't telling it again tonight. She told her brother she'd stop by over the weekend, told him not to stay up late, told him to remember his medicine, the same things she said every day, and still said with the seriousness of someone saying them for the very first time. Then she ended the call. The car crossed the bridge, the harbor lights running along the right side, and in that silence, Sadie lifted her eyes to the rearview mirror. Elias was sitting in the back seat, his face turned toward the window, his left hand resting on his knee. The ring caught the streetlights and held them for a heartbeat each time the car passed beneath another lamp. She watched exactly 2 such flashes. Then she lowered her eyes to the writing board, crossed out a line that was finished, and wrote the next one beneath it, and didn't look up again until the car came to a stop. Weston Ashby's car stopped in front of the Ambassador Hotel at 9:20, and Camille adjusted her necklace 3 times before the car door opened. At the entrance, no one asked her name. They asked for his, nodded, then opened the barrier, and she walked half a step behind him, exactly the distance expected of a companion. She knew that perfectly well, and she'd accounted for it in advance. "Do you know when the last person with the Beaumont name walked through these doors?" she said quietly as they entered the lobby. 15 years ago. It was my grandfather. After he died and my father sold the house on Prytania, my family disappeared from every list in this city, as if no one named Beaumont had ever existed. Weston smiled and said something polite, but he wasn't listening. He was looking down at his phone. The ambassador's grand ballroom was crowded tonight, exactly as Camille had imagined it for 6 months. The faces she'd seen in financial newspapers, the women whose galleries had received 3 invitations from hers on Royal Street and returned no response 3 times. She moved among them with her chin slightly raised and, for the first time in her life, with the feeling that she belonged exactly where she was. People were looking at her. She knew they were looking because she was standing beside Weston Ashby, not because she was Camille Beaumont, but tonight she was willing to accept both kinds of attention without distinguishing between them, because she'd waited too long to be looked at in any way at all. In her mind, the plan was already arranged. She would let people take 2 photographs, one in the lobby and one at the banquet table. She would mention the gallery on Royal Street exactly 3 times to 3 different people. She would tell someone she was considering expanding, and she would say it in the voice of a woman who was genuinely weighing the decision. And tomorrow morning, when this city saw her here, no one would ask who that woman was anymore, or where she had married into. Weston looked at his phone again. It was the 4th time since they'd gotten into the car. He typed quickly, his thumb moving across the screen, then turned the phone face down on his thigh. Camille noticed that he hadn't turned the screen off, only turned it face down. And she knew the difference between those 2 actions because she'd once turned her own phone face down in exactly the same way. "Who is it?" she asked. "My manager. At 9:30 on a Saturday night. She works even more than I do." Weston laughed and slipped the phone into the inner pocket of his jacket, and in the moment he bent down to do it, Camille caught the screen lighting up one last time before it went dark. There was no name at the top of the conversation, only a string of numbers. She remembered quite clearly that his manager's name was Denise, because he'd mentioned the name at least 5 times in the past 3 weeks, and someone whose name had been mentioned 5 times was usually saved in the contacts. But she didn't ask anything else. She didn't ask because that kind of question opened other questions, and tonight she didn't want to open anything. She'd spent 6 months bringing herself to this door. The man beside her was the key, and no one inspected a key while it was turning smoothly in the lock. It was a habit she'd had for a long time without ever admitting it to herself. The habit of stopping her questions precisely at the point where an answer might ruin whatever she wanted. She'd done the same thing with the man she'd married for 2 years. Every day, perfectly, and it would take her less than an hour to learn the price of it. They walked toward their table, and Weston placed a hand naturally against her back, and somewhere above them on the 2nd floor, a 76-year-old man was reviewing the sheet containing his opening remarks, and had no idea yet that he wouldn't finish reading them. The car stopped in front of the ambassador at 5 minutes before 10, and Elias stepped out alone, with Sadie 3 steps behind him carrying the briefcase. At the entrance, Two people stood behind a small table with a printed guest list, both wearing uniforms from the event company hired for the evening, both young, and neither one a member of the Delacroix family. That was the detail Sadie would remember for years afterward, that the entire evening had revolved around a 76-year-old man sitting in a private room on the second floor, reviewing the sheet containing his opening remarks, without having had time to tell anyone at the door what to do. "May I have your name?" the man on the left asked, his voice polite and completely harmless. "Rourke." A finger moved down the list, then back up for a second time, more slowly. "I'm sorry, sir. I don't see your name on the list. Do you have an invitation?" "No." Sadie stepped forward half a pace. She had prepared 3 sentences for this situation, and the first one was already on the tip of her tongue. But Elias quietly extended one hand, low and no higher than his waist, and she stopped. He didn't explain. He didn't mention Warren Delacroix. He simply stood there, both hands at his sides, wearing an unremarkable suit and the same inexpensive watch still fastened around his. The man checking the entrance looked at his colleague. His colleague shook his head. 4 steps away, a group of guests who'd just checked their coats stopped to watch, because in rooms like this, there was nothing quite as entertaining as watching someone being held at the threshold. And at that exact moment, a man's voice came from inside the ballroom, not loud, but placed at exactly the volume necessary for the 3 nearest tables to hear every word. "Let him in." Royce Kettering stood about 5 steps away with a drink in his hand, and he wasn't in any hurry. He'd seen what was happening from the very first second, and had spent every moment since deciding how to use it. And Elias knew that the instant he heard Royce's voice, because it was the voice of a man who had already finished thinking. "That's Mr. Rourke from Transportation," Royce continued, turning halfway toward the tables behind him as though he were introducing an amusing little story at dinner. "Trucks, not ships." There was a ripple of laughter from the corner of the room. Not loud laughter, not cruel laughter. Only the polite kind of laughter rooms like this offered when a remark had been placed exactly where it belonged, and that was what made it frightening. The man at the door immediately softened, nodded, stepped back, and opened the barrier, because he understood that the man standing in front of him was someone's familiar guest, not someone important. And in New Orleans, the difference between those two things was far greater than the 4 steps separating them. Sadie stood behind Elias and felt heat rush into her face. She'd spent 5 years in rooms where people called Elias Rourke by name and lowered their voices when they did. She knew exactly 3 names in that ballroom who would go pale if they knew who had just been stopped at the door. She looked at him, and what left her speechless wasn't Royce's remark, but Elias's face. There was nothing there. No anger, no humiliation, not a single muscle moved. He nodded to the man at the entrance and said, "Thank you." 2 words, clear and without sarcasm, then walked through the barrier. As he passed Royce, he stopped for exactly half a second, no more. "Mr. Kettering. Mr. Rourke." Royce raised his glass a few inches, a gesture just restrained enough that no one could call it rude. "I didn't think I'd see you here tonight." "Neither did I," Elias said, "until this afternoon." Then he kept walking. Sadie followed, and as she walked, she recorded 3 things in her mind that she would later write down. That Royce Kettering had already been inside the ballroom and knew Elias was coming before Elias had even stepped out of the car. That he'd constructed his remark in less than 10 seconds, which meant he didn't need preparation in order to strike. And that the man who had laughed in the corner of the room was one of the 3 commissioners who would have the power to vote on Pier 9, 9 weeks from now. Elias walked into the center of the ballroom and stopped in the open space before the podium, his left hand hanging straight at his side, the signet ring catching the chandelier light and holding it for a moment. No one in the room was looking down that far. No one thought there was anything worth seeing. For the next 40 seconds, this city was going to have to relearn something it had forgotten over the past 2 years. At exactly 10 o'clock, the lights in the ballroom dimmed by 1 level, and Warren Delacroix appeared at the top of the grand staircase with a sheet of paper in his hand. The entire room fell silent. He began with the same words he'd used to begin for 20 years, thanking everyone for coming, saying that this year there was more worth talking about than in any other year, and he got through perhaps a sentence and a half before he stopped. He didn't stop like a man who'd forgotten his words. He stopped like a man who had just seen something he couldn't believe and needed another 2 seconds to make certain his eyes weren't deceiving him. Then he folded the paper in half, handed it to the person standing beside him, and began walking down the staircase. Some people in the ballroom thought he was tired. Warren Delacroix was 76 years old, and in recent years he'd had to sit 3 times while someone else read his speech for him. But he didn't head toward the side door. He walked straight down, all the way to the bottom of the staircase, then turned into the aisle between the 2 rows of tables, and kept walking. Past the first table, past the third, past the people who'd spent months simply trying to earn the privilege of sitting this close to him, and he didn't stop to greet a single one of them. In New Orleans, people went to Warren Delacroix. That was the order of every room he entered, and in 20 years no one had ever seen the opposite happen. Camille was raising her glass. She stopped it halfway between the table and her lips and didn't put it down, didn't drink, simply held it there, because the old man was walking toward the open space before the podium, and there was only one person standing in that space. Warren reached him and stopped. He lifted both hands and placed them firmly on Elias's shoulders, without hurry, the way fathers did when they had missed something they never should have been allowed to miss. "You're home," he said. Elias didn't answer. He only gave a slight nod, so small that almost no one noticed, and Sadie stood 4 steps away and saw his shoulders drop by perhaps half an inch, something no one else in the entire room noticed, and something she'd been waiting 2 years to see. Warren released him, turned halfway toward the ballroom, and when he spoke, his voice didn't need to be loud, because rooms with him in them had long ago taught themselves how to fall silent. "Take a good look at this man's face," he said. "Some of what still exists in this state exists because of his father. As of tonight, he stands where he's always belonged." The first person to rise was the chairman of the Port Authority, seated at the second table. He stood neither quickly nor slowly, the way a man did who had already made his decision and was only waiting for the right moment. Camille counted. She hadn't intended to, but she counted. The second and third were the 2 judges seated at the same table, and she recognized both faces because she'd seen them on the front page of the local newspaper 3 weeks earlier. The fourth was the head of the insurance company whose gallery had sent 3 invitations and received no reply 3 times. The 5th and 6th she didn't know by name, but she knew their faces. Then she couldn't count anymore, because an entire row of tables rose at once. Then the row behind it, and the sound of chairs scraping across the wooden floor spread through the ballroom like water spilling over a low embankment. The wineglass remained exactly where it was in her hand. Weston leaned toward her, his voice dropping until it was almost inaudible. "You told me your husband drove trucks." "That's right," Camille said. She heard her own voice, and it sounded perfectly normal, perfectly calm, and she thought that was the strangest thing of all, that at the exact moment the ground beneath her feet was splitting apart, her voice remained exactly the same. She looked toward her husband, the man she'd stood before the mirror, and called ordinary less than 2 hours earlier, and she realized something worse than everything she'd just seen, that he wasn't looking toward her at all. Not once. He didn't even search for where she was sitting. The last person to stand was Royce Kettering. He let considerably more time pass than anyone else, long enough for the 2 tables around him to turn and look, then placed his glass on the table, stood, and fastened a button on his jacket that had never been undone. He didn't lower his head. He simply stood there, his eyes fixed straight across the ballroom toward the open space before the podium. And there was no fear in those eyes, none of the fear that should have been there. Elias saw it. That was the only thing all evening that truly caught his attention. When the sound of the chairs finally died down and people began sitting again, Elias turned to Sadie and said only one thing, his voice low enough that no one but her could hear. "The brown envelope, table 14. She opened her briefcase, took it out, and started walking. The ballroom was still caught in the strange condition of a room that had just been rearranged, and people were trying to figure out where the new positions were, who stood beside whom, who had just moved up, and who had just been pushed down. Then they saw the woman carrying the envelope walking out from Elias Rourke's side. Something very strange happened in rooms like this when the order of things had just changed. People reacted before they understood, and the way they reacted was by moving aside. 2 men standing in the aisle talking automatically stepped backward. A waiter carrying a tray stopped and turned to make room for her. No one greeted her. No one knew her name, but an entire row of tables turned to follow her, and for those 30 seconds, Sadie Merrick crossed the Ambassador Ballroom as though she were walking down the hallway of a building where she'd worked for 5 years, her back straight, her eyes fixed exactly where they needed to go, her left hand holding the briefcase and her right holding the envelope. Elias watched her. He'd looked at her for 5 years without ever truly seeing her, and now, In the middle of a room that had just risen to its feet for him, he saw the way a 27-year-old woman could make the most powerful people in Louisiana step aside without saying a single word. He couldn't think of anything more about it in that moment. He thought only one thing, that this was the woman who had stood beside him while he learned how to become invisible, and he'd never once asked what she had paid for doing it. Sadie reached table 14. She placed the envelope in front of Camille without saying a word, without looking at Weston, without looking at anyone else, then turned and walked straight away. Camille sat completely still for perhaps 5 seconds before touching it. She'd prepared herself for the worst, and she thought she knew what the worst could be, because she'd sat through enough dinners and galas to know that people like these punished one another with documents, not words. She opened the envelope. It wasn't divorce papers. Inside was a transfer agreement, assigning ownership of the building at 41 Royal Street. 3 stories, together with all rights to the land, to Camille Beaumont, with no conditions, no expiration, already signed, already notarized, with only her signature remaining. She turned to the second page and saw the name of the legal entity listed as the owner, a meaningless name registered in Louisiana, and the original transfer date, 18 months earlier. She read the date a second time, then a third. 18 months earlier was last fall. Last fall was when an out-of-state fund had bought up the entire block of Royal Street and doubled the rents within a single quarter, when 3 galleries around hers had closed one after another, and when the new owner had sent her a letter saying that her lease alone would remain at the old rate. She'd read that letter 3 times in the coffee shop across the street. She'd called her mother that night. She'd said that finally, someone had recognized the value of this gallery, that she'd negotiated the right way, that she'd known exactly what she was doing. She'd believed that for 18 months, and built her entire image of herself on top of it. Inside the envelope was also a small piece of paper folded in half. She recognized the handwriting immediately, because it was the same handwriting that had written notes and stuck them to the refrigerator every Tuesday morning for 2 years. "It's yours now. You'll never have to ask anyone again." Camille placed the note on the table, and her hand was no longer steady. If he'd sent divorce papers, she could have been angry. If he'd sent a lawyer, she could have fought back. If he'd done anything that a man who had just been humiliated normally did, she would have had somewhere to put her anger, and tonight would have been much easier. But he hadn't. He was sitting 20 steps away with the entire room having just risen for him, and what he'd sent her was the one thing in the world she couldn't give back. She lifted her eyes toward him. He still wasn't looking at her. And that was when Camille Beaumont understood that she hadn't lost an ordinary husband. She'd stood in front of the mirror and called a good man ordinary every day for 2 years. And he'd let her do it. Royce Kettering walked over to the first table about 20 minutes later, when the music had started again and the ballroom had found its old rhythm. He didn't ask permission to sit. He simply stopped beside Elias's chair, turned the glass in his hand, and looked across the room as though the 2 men were admiring a beautiful view together. "A memorable evening," he said. "The whole city stood up for you." Warren walked across his own ballroom. Elias didn't answer. "There's one thing I keep thinking about," Royce continued, his voice still light, still friendly, the kind of voice people used when telling a funny story everyone knew wasn't funny. "For 2 years you could have been anywhere, but you chose to stay home. And tonight your wife came here with someone else. I was sitting over there, and I heard a few things. She said you worked in transportation." He took a small sip. "People like to say that whatever's closest is the easiest thing to keep. A man who can't hold on to what's inside his own house makes me wonder how he expects to hold on to a peer out there." At the next table, 2 men stopped talking. Sadie stood 4 steps away with her briefcase in her hand, and she felt her fingers tighten around the handle, but she didn't move. Elias set his glass of water down. He didn't turn his head. He kept looking straight across the ballroom, and when he spoke, his voice was no louder than Royce's. "The renewal period for the permit to operate Pier 9 comes due in 9 weeks. The Port Authority Board votes in the 10th week. You filed your competing application on the 17th of last month, which was 4 days after you learned that the 3rd commissioner was retiring and someone new would be taking his seat." Royce said nothing. "The replacement is named Halloran," Elias said. "He has a mortgage loan in Metairie that was refinanced in April through a Baton Rouge bank, in which you're a minority shareholder. There's nothing illegal about that, but it's the kind of detail a board usually prefers to know before it votes rather than after." For the next 3 seconds, no one said anything. Those were 3 seconds Sadie would remember for a very long time, because she'd sat in enough meetings to know that this was the moment a man recalculated everything he thought he knew. Then Royce laughed. It wasn't an awkward laugh. He genuinely laughed, briefly, almost with satisfaction, and pulled out the chair beside him and sat down slowly, like a man who had just had something confirmed, not a man who had just been threatened. "So you're still watching," he said. "I still read. For 2 straight years, no one saw you anywhere. No meetings, no parties, not a single call. Do you know what people said about you during those 2 years, Mr. Rourke?" Royce set his glass on the table. "They said you were finished, that the name died with your father and his son went off and got married." He looked up, and this time he looked directly into Elias's face. "I didn't believe that, but I wasn't the only one placing bets, and I want you to know I made mine a long time ago, not tonight." He stood, fastened the same jacket button he had fastened earlier, and gave a perfectly proper nod. "Congratulations on coming back. We have 9 weeks." Then he walked away. Elias remained seated, watching him disappear. It should have been a neat little victory, and everyone within 3 tables thought it was a victory. Sadie stepped over and stood beside him, and for about half a minute, she thought the same thing. But Elias didn't. He'd spent his entire life in rooms where people spoke to one another through everything they didn't say, and he knew exactly what should have appeared on the face of a man who had just had his entire file read back to him in the middle of a party. There should have been uncertainty somewhere, even if only for half a second. It hadn't been there. Royce Kettering had just heard the name Halloran, and the only thing he did was sit down. "He's not afraid," Elias said quietly. Sadie watched Royce's figure disappear into the crowd. "No, sir. People are only unafraid when they already have what they need," Elias said. "He's waiting for something." He didn't know that what Royce was waiting for had been inside this ballroom all evening, sitting at table 14 with a transfer document in front of her, and the phone of the man beside her lying face down on the table. Sadie got back to the office at nearly 1 in the morning and didn't turn on the ceiling lights, only the desk lamp, because she had no intention of staying long. She took the list out of her briefcase and spread it across the desk, and the name on the 4th line from the bottom was still sitting inside the faint circle she'd drawn earlier that evening, with the question mark beside it. She sat there staring at it and let her mind wander, because she'd learned a long time ago that memory wasn't something you could force. It only answered when you stopped asking. She thought about the Ambassador Ballroom. She thought about the way Royce Kettering had sat down instead of stepping back. Then she thought about the 3 words Elias had said when they left, that people were only unafraid when they already had what they needed. And she stood up and walked toward the filing cabinet at the far end of the room. 3 years earlier, when the port reopened the bidding records for the Eastern Warehouse District, she had sat through a night exactly like this one, reading the entire list of applicants to find a discrepancy in the tax figures. She had found it, and while she was searching, she had read through more than 40 legal entity names she had no reason to remember. She pulled open the drawer for that year and began turning pages. She found it at nearly 2 o'clock. The same name, the same registered address in Baton Rouge. 3 years earlier, it had been one of the entities that submitted a bid, and in the shareholder disclosure on the final page, the small print no one read, Royce Kettering's name, appeared on the 2nd line. Sadie sat perfectly still. Then she opened her computer and did something no one would normally have thought to do. She typed the name of that fund together with Weston Ashby's name. The result appeared on the first page. No digging was required. No secrecy. Because in the film industry, people didn't hide things like that. They printed them in the closing credits. Both films that had taken Weston Ashby from someone no one knew to a name on billboards had been financed by the same fund in Baton Rouge. The first one had begun filming 11 months earlier. She sat staring at the screen and felt the cold, sinking sensation in her stomach of someone who had just placed 2 numbers beside each other and watched them match. She took a sheet of paper, wrote out the timeline, and watched it appear in front of her with brutal clarity. 11 months earlier, that fund had financed Weston's film. 7 months earlier, Royce had begun preparing the competing application for Pier 9. 6 months earlier, according to something Camille had once mentioned over dinner that Sadie had only half heard through the phone while calling in a report, her gallery had been invited to host an exhibition attended by a young actor who had stayed for a very long time. And 1 month earlier, the application had been filed. She called it 2:10. Elias answered after the first ring, and his voice was fully awake. which meant he hadn't gone to sleep either. Weston Ashby isn't her lover, Sadie said. She didn't ease into it. She never had with him. He's an antenna. His entire career was built with money from the same fund Royce Kettering was listed as a shareholder in 3 years ago. He was steered toward her 6 months ago, exactly when Royce began preparing the application. There was no sound on the other end. He doesn't need to know any of your secrets, she continued. He only needs to know one thing, whether you've truly withdrawn. And for 6 months, he's been asking that question through someone who sits at the dinner table with you every night. Sadie looked down at the paper in front of her. Her husband never travels for work, never takes calls after 9, hasn't left New Orleans in 2 years. No one calls the house. There's nothing in the closet except a few ordinary suits. She stopped. That isn't a secret, sir. That's gossip. People tell things like that without ever realizing what they're telling. A long time passed before Elias spoke. She didn't know. No, sir. Sadie closed her eyes for a moment. She didn't know. That's the worst part. On the other end of the line, inside the house that had grown far too large, Elias Rourke sat down on the edge of the bed and heard again in his mind the words that had closed that evening. He's too ordinary. He never belonged. It turned out Camille had been right about one thing she'd never meant to say. For 2 years, she had believed her husband was a man with nothing worth discovering, and she had told the whole world exactly that, naturally, carelessly, without questioning it once, until someone finally knew how to listen. The petition was filed Monday morning, and the meeting took place 9 days later at a law office on Poydras Street, on the 11th floor, in the smallest of the building's 3 conference rooms. Elias arrived 5 minutes early. Camille arrived exactly on time, alone, without a lawyer of her own. And they had to ask her twice to make certain she understood what she was declining. She sat across from him and kept her handbag on her lap instead of placing it on the table. Elias's attorney began reading. He started with the division of property, and Camille didn't interrupt. He stated that the petitioner wasn't seeking the return of anything transferred before the filing date, including ownership of the building at 41 Royal Street, and that the transfer was unconditional and irrevocable. He asked whether she had any objections. Camille said no. He continued with the uncontested settlement provisions. Asked again, and once more she said no. The entire process took less than 3 minutes. Then the attorney closed the file and said that if neither party had anything further, he would prepare the final version for signature later that week. Camille put down her pen. I have one question, she said. Not for you. For him. The attorney looked at Elias. Elias nodded, and the other man stood, gathered the papers, and walked out, closing the door behind him. 2 people remained in the room, separated by a table far longer than 2 people needed. Camille didn't look at him immediately. She looked down at her hands, and in that silence Elias noticed that she had taken off her wedding ring, not today, but long enough ago that even the pale band around her finger had begun to fade. 6 months ago, she said, a man came into the gallery. He asked me about you. Not directly. He asked the way people make small talk, saying my husband must travel a lot, that working in transportation must keep you busy. And I laughed and said no. You come home at 7 every night, and you haven't left the city once in 2 years. She looked up. I told it like it was something boring. I used it to complain. Elias said nothing. Last week someone called me, a reporter, or someone claiming to be one. He asked whether I knew anything about Pier 9. Camille said it very calmly. I didn't even know what Pier 9 was. Elias. I had to look it up online. He remained silent, and that silence wasn't avoidance. It was the only thing he could still give her without making everything worse. I didn't come here to ask you to take me back, she said. I know there's nothing left to go back to, and I didn't come here to say that if I'd known who you were, I would have treated you differently, because I think that's probably the worst thing anyone could say to you, and I've already been bad enough to you. She drew in a breath. I only want to ask one question, and I want you to answer it truthfully. Then I'll sign and leave. She looked directly at him. If I had asked you, even once, at any point in those 2 years, if I'd asked what your father did, or what your life was like before you met me, or why you never answered the phone after 9 o'clock, would you have told me? Elias looked at her. He had sold the old car. He had worn the cheapest watch in the cabinet for 730 days. He had deliberately reduced every part of himself until it fit the man she believed her husband to be. And through all of it, he had waited for one question she never asked, telling himself that waiting was fair, That this was the test. That if she asked, it would mean she saw him. It had never occurred to him that the test was also a way for him to avoid being the one who spoke first. "Yes," he said. Camille nodded slowly, once, as though she had already known the answer and only needed to hear it aloud. Then she picked up the pen and signed the draft, stood, and walked toward the door. At the threshold she stopped but didn't turn around. "You lied to me on the phone," she said. "About the stranger who came asking questions. I know you lied." Then she left. The meeting lasted 4 minutes and 20 seconds from the moment the attorney stepped out of the room. Elias remained sitting there alone for a long time after the door had closed, and what left him unable to stand wasn't anything she had said. It was the realization that he had spent 2 years waiting for a woman to find something he himself had hidden. There was one detail Camille had mentioned at the end of the meeting that Elias hadn't explained, and to understand it, the story had to go back 4 days, to a Thursday evening when his phone vibrated at nearly 10 o'clock, and the screen showed the name he still hadn't deleted from his contacts. He let it ring 3 times before answering. "I'm not calling to talk about the past," Camille said immediately, before he even had a chance to say hello. "I just need to ask you one thing, then I'll hang up. I'm listening." There was a sound on the other end, the sound of her walking through a room and closing a door. "A man came into the gallery today. He didn't buy anything. He walked around for about 20 minutes, then started talking to me. He asked if I used to be married to someone in transportation." She paused. "Elias. He knew we were separated. He knew before I told him." Elias's voice didn't change. "What else did he ask?" "He asked whether you traveled much for work when we were still together, whether you ever left the state, whether anyone called the house at night." Her voice began to quicken slightly, and I answered him. I answered automatically, the way people answer a polite stranger in a store. I said no. He comes home at 7 every night. He hasn't left the city once in 2 years. It only felt strange after I'd already said it. He heard her breathe out. "Did I do something wrong?" Elias closed his eyes. On the table in front of him was the sheet of paper where Sadie had written out the timeline that night. 11 months, 7 months, 6 months, 1 month, the numbers lying beside one another and fitting together with merciless precision. He knew who had sent the man to the gallery that day. He knew why the man had come now instead of 6 months earlier, because 6 months earlier Royce Kettering had still had an antenna sitting across the dinner table from her, and last week that antenna had stopped calling her, and a man like Royce never allowed a source of information to go silent without replacing it with something else. He knew that for 6 months, every casual thing Camille had said about him had gone straight into someone's file, and he knew that if he told her all of that, the woman on the other end of the line would do exactly what anyone would do. She would panic. She would call Weston and demand answers. She would try to find the man who had come into the gallery, and within 48 hours, Royce Kettering would know that Elias Rourke knew. "No," Elias said, "you didn't do anything wrong. But I told him all those things. Those are things anyone could know. There's nothing in them." He heard his own voice, and it was as calm as he wanted it to be. "Some people in the press are looking for stories about the Delacroix family after that night. They're asking around the edges. Don't worry about it." There was a silence. "Are you sure?" "I'm sure." It was the first lie he had spoken to her in 2.5 years. He had hidden many things from her, had stayed silent countless times, had allowed her to believe things that weren't true, but he had never actually spoken a false sentence to her, and he realized that in the very moment he said it. "If he comes back, just tell him you don't remember anything else," Elias continued. "Don't argue with him. Don't ask who he is. Just be polite and remember nothing. You're talking like something's wrong." "Nothing's wrong, Camille." She was silent for a long time, then said thank you, then ended the call before he did. Elias remained sitting there with the phone in his hand and didn't stand up for nearly an hour, because this was the point where everything closed into a very neat trap, and he could see it as clearly as a diagram. Where was the only evidence in the world that Royce Kettering had used someone to watch him for 6 months? It was in 6 months of messages between Weston Ashby and an unsaved string of numbers. It was in the testimony of a woman who had answered hundreds of questions without knowing they were questions. To drag Royce into the light, Elias would have to open that box, and the moment he did, Camille Beaumont would no longer be an outsider. She would become the person who had supplied information, for 6 months, to a party competing for a port permit, and no court in the world would care that she had done it without knowing. He could win, or he could leave her alone. The board would vote in 9 weeks, and sometime during those 9 weeks, he would have to choose between the two. Royce Kettering never called again after the night at the Ambassador, and that was exactly what worried Sadie most. He didn't need to call. Over the next 4 weeks, he didn't appear anywhere Elias was, didn't send anyone to him, didn't say a single word about Pier 9 to anyone who might repeat it. He simply worked through procedure, and procedure had no face to look into. In the first week, a petition was filed with the Port Authority Board requesting a review of every pier operating contract issued before 2009, on the grounds that the old terms no longer met current safety standards. 11 contracts fell under that review. Only one of them truly mattered, and everyone knew which one it was. In the second week, the board secretary announced that because of the scope of the review, the renewal for Pier 9 would no longer be handled through the expedited process used for the past 14 years, but would instead go before the full board for a vote. In the third week, an independent technical report was filed with the petition, 42 pages long, concluding that the western dock system at Pier 9 showed signs of deterioration and that the operator's capacity needed to be reassessed. Sadie read that report over 2 nights and discovered that the inspection company named on it had completed 4 contracts for Royce's companies over the previous 3 years. But that wasn't illegal, and that was the entire art of what was happening. Nothing Royce did was illegal. He didn't bribe anyone, didn't threaten anyone, didn't violate a single provision. He simply took what had always moved in the shadows, dragged it into the light of procedure, and forced a man who had spent his entire life avoiding that light to stand in the middle of it and answer questions. That was how a man fought when he knew exactly what his opponent feared. In the 4th week, 2 of the 3 commissioners with voting power stopped accepting meetings with representatives from Bayou Line Freight. No one refused them. The meetings were simply postponed, then postponed again, then followed by promises that someone would be in touch. Sadie effectively moved into the office. She built a rebuttal file 3 times longer than the report itself, gathering 14 years of inspection records for Pier 9, comparing every item, marking every place where the new report had applied this year's standards to a structure built under the standards of that year. She worked on it 4 nights in a row, and on the 4th night she didn't go home at all. Elias came to the office at 5 in the morning because he hadn't been able to sleep either, and he intended only to pick up the file and leave. The light on the 3rd floor was still on. He walked in and found Sadie asleep at her desk, her head resting on her left arm, her face turned toward the window, her right hand still lying on the stack of papers as though she had stopped halfway through a line and meant to close her eyes for only a minute. 2 cups of cold coffee sat on the desk, and a pen had rolled close to the edge. He stood in the doorway longer than necessary. He thought about all those evenings over the past 2 years when he had come home at 7 and sat down to dinner in a room with another woman, and he realized that on those very same nights, the light on the 3rd floor of the old building on Chartres Street had still been burning, and he had never once asked himself why. He stepped inside, took off his coat, and laid it over her shoulders slowly, careful not to let his hand touch her. She didn't wake. He looked down at the papers beneath her hand and saw the final line she had left unfinished. A note about an inspection record from 2011, ending halfway through a word. He didn't adjust her position. He didn't leave her a note. He didn't wake her to say thank you, because he knew that if he did, she would sit up immediately, apologize for falling asleep, and begin giving him a progress report within 10 seconds. And he didn't want to make her do that at 5 in the morning. He simply stood there for another 3 seconds or so, then switched off the desk lamp so the light wouldn't shine in her face, walked out, and closed the door as quietly as he could. In the car, he sat for a while before starting the engine. He had spent 2 years waiting for one woman to ask him a question. During those same 2 years, on the 3rd floor of an old building, there had been another woman who had never needed to ask one at all. By the 5th week, it was clear that the rebuttal file wasn't enough, and Gus Thibodeau was the one who said it aloud. He said that if they wanted to stop Royce Kettering at the board level, they had to prove what the Baton Rouge Fund had actually used its money for, and if they wanted to prove that, there was only one place left in the world that still held the records. He went down to the basement of the building on Chartres Street and opened the wall safe Patrick Rourke had installed when he was 38 years old. Gus alone had the combination. He had kept it for 8 years and hadn't opened the safe once since the funeral. Inside were more than 40 hardbound files, arranged by year, without labels, and he carried every one of them up to the 3rd floor and set them on the conference table at nearly 9 o'clock that evening. Sadie took the final 3 files, the oldest years, the part no one expected to contain anything useful. She read the way she always read, with the tip of her pen, 1 line at a time, making notes in the margins. Close to 11, she opened the file from the year her father died. It was an internal report, typed, without a title, with only a single line at the top of the first page, stating that it was a summary of the incident at warehouse number 7. She read the first section, and it matched everything the entire city already knew. The date, the time, the investigators' conclusion that the cause had been structural failure resulting from inadequate maintenance. Then she turned to the second section, the longer section, the part that didn't exist in any public record. It stated that 3 weeks before the incident, the structural maintenance contract for warehouse number 7 had been transferred from the previous contractor to a new company. It gave the name of that new company. It stated that the company was partly owned by a legal entity registered in Baton Rouge, and on the shareholder disclosure was the name Royce Kettering, then 28 years old, alongside the name of his father. It stated that at the time, the Kettering family and Patrick Rourke were fighting over operating rights to 2 adjoining piers, and that warehouse number 7 was the property Patrick had used as collateral for his application. It stated that after the incident, that application was withdrawn, and on the final page of that section was a list of the people working the morning shift that day. 19 names, typed and arranged alphabetically. Sadie reached the 11th name and stopped. Merrick, T. Morning shift, Area B. She sat perfectly still. She didn't stand, didn't cry out, didn't drop anything. She simply placed her pen down, very precisely, parallel with the edge of the file, and stared at the page for a length of time she would later be unable to measure. Across the table, Gus looked up, saw her face, and understood immediately because he was the only person in the room who knew both halves of the story. He stood and walked out without saying a word. Elias arrived 3 minutes later. He didn't ask whether she was all right. He pulled out the chair across from her and sat down, and when he spoke, he used the voice of a man who had prepared for this moment for a long time, and still hadn't prepared enough. "My father sent money to your mother every month for 7 years, he said. Not because he was a good man. He sent it because he owed you. Your father went to work that morning in a warehouse my father was using as collateral for his application, and he failed to keep it safe." Sadie didn't look up. "When you were 22, you knocked on the door of this office and said you wanted to repay the debt with work. I saw your name in the file that same day." He stopped. "I hired you anyway, and I kept you here for 5 years without telling you a single word about any of this." Outside the window, a barge sounded a long horn on the river. "You have every right to stand up and walk out of here tonight," Elias said. "You have every right never to come back. And if you want to bring this into the open, I'll sign anything you need." Sadie raised her eyes. They were red, but her voice didn't shake. And that was the thing Elias would remember for years afterward. "I'm not leaving," she said. She closed the file and placed her hand on top of it. "For 5 years, I've believed I was here because I owed someone a debt. I worked like someone paying that debt, and I did it very well, and I never once asked myself whether I wanted to be here, because someone repaying a debt isn't allowed to ask that question." She pushed the file toward him. "Now I know. The debt wasn't mine. It never was." She looked directly at him. "I'm still staying, but from now on, I'm not doing this because of the debt. I'm doing it because I choose to." Elias looked at her for a long moment. Then he nodded, and for the first time in 5 years, he said her name without attaching an instruction to it. 2 days later, Elias called 7 people into the 3rd-floor conference room at 7 o'clock in the morning and laid out his plan in less than 4 minutes. He said Bayou Line wouldn't fight Kettering's application. He said that instead, the company would voluntarily ask the Port Authority Board to place Pier 9 under a shared oversight structure, meaning the operating rights would no longer belong to a single party but would be placed under the Port Authority's management and allocation, with operators licensed in cycles and subjected to public audits. He said that if Pier 9 was no longer something one party could possess outright, then it would no longer be something worth spending 15 years trying to take. Then he set the file on the table and said nothing more. Gus Thibodeau was the first to speak, and he didn't stand to do it. He spoke from his chair, his voice low in the way of a man trying hard to keep it low. "No." Elias looked at him. "No," Gus said again. "You want me to sit here and listen to you say we're going to take that pier with our own hands and put it on the table for the board to divide up?" He pushed the file several inches away. Do you know how many years your father spent holding onto that place? I do. I was there. I sat beside him in this office, when he had to mortgage the very building we're sitting in just to keep his application standing. His voice broke slightly at the end of the sentence, barely enough to hear, then he brought it back under control. And you know what happened after that? You read it last week. Your father died because of that place, Elias. Not that same day, but he began dying that day, and everything that came afterward started there. No one in the room said anything. And now you're sitting here? Gus said, planning to give it away. The man at the far end of the table, who had overseen warehouse operations for 11 years, nodded and said he agreed with Gus. A second man said that if Pier 9 went under shared oversight, 27 people in the company would lose their permanent contracts within a year, and he had no idea how he was supposed to explain that to them. A third said nothing, but he didn't look at Elias either. Within 40 seconds, half the room had taken Gus's side, and what made it difficult wasn't that they were wrong. They weren't wrong. They were simply protecting exactly what they'd been taught to protect for 30 years. Sadie sat at the end of the table and let the room finish speaking. Then she opened her briefcase, took out the hardbound file she had read that night, placed it on the table, and didn't open it. There are 19 names in this file, she said. Everyone turned toward her. It's the morning shift roster from warehouse number 7. Mr. Gus knows what I'm talking about. Mr. Rourke knows too. The rest of you in this room don't know yet, and I think it's time you did. She placed her hand on the cover. That warehouse was put up as collateral in a dispute over a pier application. 3 weeks before the incident, its maintenance contract was transferred to a Kettering company. 19 people went to work that morning without knowing anything about the fight over the pier. They didn't know the name Kettering. They didn't know they were standing inside someone else's game. She stopped. The 11th name on that list is my father. No one moved. For 15 years, I thought it was an accident, Sadie said. Now I know it wasn't, and I'm sitting here while all of you debate whether we should keep that pier. And I want to ask you one question. She looked around the table, one person at a time. If we keep it, then 15 years from now there will be someone else sitting in this room saying his father died because of that place. Maybe it'll be one of ours. Maybe it'll be one of theirs. But there will be someone. Because as long as Pier 9 is something only one side can hold, it will remain worth doing anything to possess. She turned to Gus. You said his father died because of that place. You were right. But he didn't die because the place belonged to him. He died because it could belong to someone. Then she pushed the file toward the middle of the table and sat down. Gus Thibodeau looked at the file for a very long time. Then he stood, picked up the coat hanging over the back of his chair, and walked out of the room without saying another word. The door closed very softly behind him, and because it was soft, it felt even heavier. 6 people remained in the room, and no one spoke. Elias looked at Sadie, and she looked back at him, and in that moment, they both understood that what had just happened wasn't a subordinate defending her superior. It was 2 people choosing the same thing, and one of them had paid for the right to say it with her own father. There were 36 hours left before the vote, and Elias wanted to inspect the western section of the pier mentioned in the technical report himself, so the 2 of them arrived at Pier 9 at nearly 11 o'clock that night. Sadie brought the inspection records and a flashlight. They walked along the row of warehouses, checking each item against each page, and they had been at it for about 40 minutes when the entire area lost power. Darkness fell quickly and completely, leaving nothing but the distant lights of the city reflecting across the water. Downriver, a tugboat sounded a long horn, then went silent. Sadie switched on the flashlight. The beam landed on a man standing about 10 steps away, both hands in the pockets of his coat, and there was no telling how long he had been there. I called your office 3 times this week, Royce Kettering said. No one called me back. You knew I wouldn't. I knew. Royce took 2 steps forward and stopped, close enough to talk, and far enough that no one could misunderstand his intentions. So I came here. I thought this was the appropriate place. Elias didn't move. Sadie lowered the flashlight until it illuminated the ground between the 3 of them and held her hand steady. The board votes the day after tomorrow, Royce said. I read your proposal. Shared oversight. Very clever. If it passes, 15 years of my preparation becomes waste paper, and so does 15 years of yours. Except you don't lose anything more, while I lose everything. I think you knew that when you wrote it. I knew. Then I'll keep this brief. Royce pulled his phone from his coat pocket, opened it, and turned the screen toward Elias. Elias didn't step closer, but he could see enough. It was a photograph of a message thread, with a date at the top and lines beneath it that he recognized immediately. Not because he had ever read them before, but because he knew exactly who they were about. He never goes anywhere. He comes home at 7. He turns his phone off after 9. 6 months, Royce said. There are more than 40 exchanges like this. I kept every one of them, along with the payment records for the man who sent them, and that man is very eager to cooperate with whoever asks him first. He slipped the phone back into his pocket. Now let me tell you what this will look like if it reaches the people it needs to reach. It won't look like a woman who was used. It will look like a woman who spent 6 months providing information about an opponent to a party competing for a federal port permit, with a recipient, a money trail, and dates. I don't need her convicted of anything, Mr. Rourke. I only need her questioned. Questioned for 2 years, 3 years, under bright lights, with the Beaumont name printed on every page. Royce gave a slight shrug. Withdraw the proposal. Pier 9 comes to me this cycle, and I forget I ever had those screenshots. No one spoke for a while. Below them, water struck the pilings in a slow, steady rhythm. You've already divorced her, Royce added, his voice almost kind. She called you ordinary in front of the entire city. No one in the world would blame you for letting her take care of herself. I'll give you until the morning after tomorrow. Then he turned and disappeared toward the gate without hurrying, and a few minutes later, they heard a car engine start somewhere in the distance. The power still hadn't returned. Sadie switched off the flashlight because the battery was running low, and the two of them stood beside each other in the darkness. He never intended to win the vote, she said. No. Elias's voice was dry. He knows he's going to lose. He just needs me to withdraw. What are you going to do? Elias didn't answer immediately. He thought about the conference room that morning and the door Gus had closed behind him. He thought about the 27 people who would lose their permanent contracts. He thought about the woman who had stood in front of the mirror and told him he had never belonged, then walked out without slowing down once, and about how 2 days from now he could simply let everything happen and there wouldn't be a single person in the world who could point at him and say he had done something wrong. That was precisely what made it difficult. It wasn't what he would lose. It was that he wouldn't lose anything at all. She didn't understand what she was sending out, he said. No, Sadie replied. She didn't understand. Then she turned toward him in the darkness, and her voice was very quiet, but there wasn't a trace of hesitation in it. Sir, I'm going to say this once, and then I won't say it again. If you leave her to face this alone, you'll become exactly what she thought you were. The port lights came back on at that exact moment, all at once, with a small pop from the electrical box, and the entire pier flooded with light. Elias stood in that brightness and looked toward the water, and he didn't say another word for the entire drive back. Elias didn't sleep that night, and at 4 o'clock in the morning he called his attorney, then called Camille at 7 and told her the truth. All of it, in 11 minutes, without leaving out a single detail, including the part where he had lied to her on the phone. She was silent for a very long time on the other end. Then she asked what he wanted her to do, and he told her he wanted her to go with his attorney to meet with the board that afternoon and tell them exactly what had happened, no more and no less, and that she had every right to refuse, and if she did, he would still do the rest. Camille said she would come. The hearing began at 2 o'clock that afternoon at the Port Authority building, and Elias was the first person registered to speak. He didn't begin by reading his proposal. He placed a file on the chairperson's table and said that before the board voted, there was something the board needed to know, and that he took personal responsibility for every page in it. Then he spoke for 22 minutes. He named the legal entity registered in Baton Rouge and listed its shareholders. He identified the 4 contracts that the inspection company behind the technical report had performed for affiliated entities over the previous 3 years. He disclosed Commissioner Halloran's refinancing arrangement and asked that Halloran voluntarily recuse himself from the vote, and Halloran stood and walked out of the room before anyone had a chance to demand it. He traced the money flowing from that fund into the 2 films, named the recipient, and laid out the 6 months of messages. Then he invited Camille Beaumont into the room. She sat beside his attorney and told the entire story in 15 minutes, in the steady voice of someone who had rehearsed 3 times so her voice wouldn't break. She said she had answered hundreds of questions without knowing they were questions. She said she hadn't received a single dollar and hadn't known who she was providing information to. And then she added one sentence that hadn't appeared in any of the prepared statements, that she had spent 2 years living beside a man without ever asking him a single question about himself, that this was why she knew nothing, and that she was sorry she had allowed her own indifference to become someone else's weapon. The hearing room remained silent after that sentence longer than necessary. Finally, Elias presented his proposal. He said Bayou Line Freight was voluntarily surrendering its exclusive operating rights to Pier 9 and requesting that the pier be placed under the Port Authority's shared oversight structure, allocated in cycles, publicly audited, and applied equally to every operator, including his own company. He said he was asking for no conditions in return. In the back row, Gus Thibodeau stood, draped his coat over his arm, and walked out. He didn't slam the door. He didn't look at anyone. Elias heard his footsteps all the way down the corridor and didn't turn around once, because he knew that if he did, he wouldn't be able to finish what remained. The board voted at 4-10. The proposal passed with 6 votes in favor. Royce Kettering lost his leverage in a single afternoon, not because anyone had defeated him, but because the thing he had spent 15 years trying to possess had ceased to exist in a form that could be possessed. 2 weeks later, the Baton Rouge Fund was placed under review. His competing application was withdrawn, and he didn't appear at another party in New Orleans for the rest of that winter. Camille testified as a witness under the protection of Elias's attorney and wasn't prosecuted for anything. She called him exactly once, one evening near the end of the month, and the call lasted less than 2 minutes. "I don't know what to say," she said. "You didn't owe me anything, and you still did it. I didn't do it for you." Elias didn't say it coldly. He was simply telling the truth. "I did it because I didn't want to be someone who could stand aside and let it happen. If I had let that happen, I would have had to spend the rest of my life living with a version of myself I couldn't bear." She was silent for a moment, then said thank you, and they never called each other again. 3 months later, Camille Beaumont sold the building at 41 Royal Street. She sold it at market value, and no one forced her to sell. She moved to Natchez and opened a small shop selling antiques and paintings by local artists, a place no one in New Orleans knew about and no one needed to know about. Someone later said that she seemed more at peace than before. She had lost a marriage, a city, and an image of herself she had spent 15 years building. What she gained in return was the first thing in her life she had truly made her own, and it was small, and it belonged to her, and she didn't have to ask anyone for it. By October, Elias was living in a small house he had rented in Bywater after selling the old one, and Gus Thibodeau showed up one Saturday afternoon without warning, standing at the gate with his hat in his hand. He didn't apologize, and Elias didn't ask him to. He said only one thing: "Your father wouldn't have done what you did, but I think he'd be glad you aren't like him." Then he came inside and sat down, and from that day on he began coming every week again, just as he had before. Late that afternoon, only 2 people remained sitting in the yard. Sadie had brought the minutes from the final hearing for Elias to sign, and she placed them on the table but didn't immediately stand and leave as she always did. Elias looked at the papers, then pushed them aside. "You've stood beside me for 5 years, he said, "and I've never asked what you wanted." Sadie was silent for a moment. "You never asked, because I never allowed you to ask." She said it in the calm voice of someone who had arranged the sentence in her mind a very long time ago, and had never believed the day would come when she would say it aloud. "When you were another woman's husband, I was never going to be the reason anything broke. Not once. Not one sentence. Not one look. I lived with that for 5 years, and I was able to sleep at night because of it, and I wouldn't trade that for anything." "There's nothing left to break now," Elias said. She looked toward the fence, then back at him, then asked me again. They married the following April, in the courtyard of an old church in Marigny, with fewer than 30 guests, and no one there simply to be seen. Warren Delacroix walked her in, moving very slowly because his knees were no longer strong, and he refused to let anyone help him. Colin stood up from his chair to hug his sister as she passed, and he held on longer than either of them had intended, and no one hurried them. Gus sat in the back row and cleaned his glasses twice. Sadie wore an ivory dress she had chosen herself, and when Elias asked why she had chosen that color, she only said it was the only color she had ever imagined. 14 months later, on a June morning, sunlight rose early over the porch facing the Mississippi River. Elias sat on the steps with his daughter in his arms, little June, 6 months old, laughing because a leaf had drifted past, and apparently it was the funniest thing in the world. Sadie stood in the doorway with a cup of coffee and watched the 2 of them for a long time without saying anything. A ship's horn sounded somewhere on the river, and the baby turned her head toward the sound and laughed even harder. That afternoon, while straightening one of the bookshelves, Sadie found an old leather-bound notebook that belonged to Elias, the kind of personal expense ledger he had used since his 20s. She opened it, intending only to put it away neatly, and her eyes stopped on the final pages. There, one line for every month across 3 years, was the same amount and the same signature. She knew exactly which 3 years they were. Padraic Rourke had died when she was 19. The money had continued arriving at her family's home every month until she was 22, and had gone to the office on Chartres Street herself. She had always assumed it was some administrative arrangement left behind by a dead man, but the signature on those final entries wasn't the father's. It was the son's, when he had been only 28, when all he knew was a name on a list, and had never even seen the face of the person who carried it. Sadie sat on the floor with the notebook open across her lap. Outside on the porch came the sound of her daughter laughing, and the sound of her husband speaking to the little girl in the voice he used for only one person in the world. She closed the notebook, put it back exactly where she had found it, and stood up to walk out onto the porch. She didn't ask him. Some things didn't need to be spoken for two people to know them together, and some gifts could only keep their shape as long as no one gave them a name. This story leaves behind something very simple. A person's worth isn't measured by what they hold in their hands, but by whether someone is willing to look at them long enough to truly see them. People so often measure one another by a coat, by a car, by the name printed on a business card, and they miss one another because of that very habit. Camille spent 2 years beside a good man and called him ordinary, not because she was cruel, but because she never chose to ask. Sadie never needed to ask, because she had been looking all along. And the rarest kind of power in this world isn't the power people display, but the power they willingly put away, simply because they want to be loved as an ordinary human being. If you've listened this far, please subscribe to our channel, leave a like, and share this story so we can continue bringing you more compelling videos every day. How do you feel about the story of Elias and Sadie? And if you had been in their situation, what would you have chosen? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. We truly want to hear what comes from the deepest part of your heart. We wish you and your family lasting good health, a joyful life, and peace in every day. Goodbye for now, and we'll see you again in the next video.